In the far reaches of the galaxy, there existed a planet named Erythia, a world of stunning beauty with sprawling forests, endless oceans, and peaceful cities. The Erythians, the native inhabitants of the planet, were a calm and quiet people. Their society valued peace, knowledge, and harmony with nature. They had never known war or strife, their civilization built on centuries of careful cultivation. But all of that was about to change. For years, their once thriving planet had become the target of the Wraith, an alien species that saw other worlds as nothing more than resources to be harvested. The Wraith were merciless conquerors, constantly expanding their empire across the stars. They came without warning, raiding peaceful planets and leaving devastation in their wake. Their ships were powerful, their technology advanced, and their resolve unbreakable. Erythia had been no exception. The Wraith first arrived in the Erythian system several cycles ago, announcing their intentions to the leaders of the planet with nothing but cold, indifferent commands. "Surrender your resources," they had said. "Your planet is now part of the Wraith Empire." At first, the Erythians had tried to resist, sending peaceful emissaries and offering trade agreements, hoping to avoid bloodshed. But the Wraith had no interest in cooperation. They demanded total submission. It didn't take long for the Erythians to realize the full extent of the Wraith's cruelty. Their military might was far superior to anything the Erythians had. Their forces overwhelmed the planet's defenses within a matter of weeks. Major cities were destroyed, entire populations enslaved, and resources were drained at a terrifying rate. The peaceful Erythians had been powerless against this relentless onslaught. Desperation spread through the streets of every surviving city as the people began to understand that there was no way out. Many had lost hope, their spirits broken by the horrors that the Wraith had wrought. The once proud civilizations that had built Erythia's cities now lay in ruins, and the Erythians' way of life seemed to be lost forever. In the midst of their suffering, a final, desperate plea went out to the stars. The leaders of Erythia knew that they had no army left to fight. They had no weapons to defend themselves, but they had one last hope: the distress signal. It was a message, broadcasted across the vast stretches of space, meant for any race capable of hearing it. "We need help," the message began. "We are the people of Erythia, a world under attack by the Wraith. Our resources are being drained, our people are enslaved, and our cities are falling.
We have no means of resistance. We seek any who can help us.
Please, we beg for rescue." The signal was sent in every known language, broadcasted across the galaxy, hoping that someone, anyone, might hear it and respond. Days passed, then weeks, then months. But there was no answer. The stars were silent. The Erythians knew that they were not alone in the galaxy, yet none of the nearby systems responded to their cry for help. Their message, like many others before it, seemed to vanish into the cold emptiness of space. Was there no one out there who would come to their aid? It was then, when all hope seemed lost, that an answer finally came. But it was not the one the Erythians had expected. The first sign of it came as a ripple in the fabric of space, a disturbance that lingered in the quiet void of the system. Erythians, weary from months of waiting, were still trying to rebuild their lives in the midst of chaos when the news broke across their planetary networks. At first, it seemed too good to be true. Ships, alien ships, had entered the system. But these were not Wraith ships. The ships that arrived were unlike any the Erythians had ever seen. Their designs were strange, rugged, and alien, with sharp lines and jagged edges that gave off an intimidating presence. These were not the sleek, polished vessels of the Wraith. No, these were different, far more intimidating. The Erythians watched as the ships descended from the heavens, their engines roaring as they cut through the atmosphere. The ships landed on Erythia, not in the major cities, but in remote, desolate regions. They were a long way from the Wraith's strongholds, but that only added to the fear and uncertainty of the Erythians. The people had no idea who these newcomers were or what they wanted. Were they saviors? Or were they just another form of conqueror? It didn't take long for the people to find out. The first contact came when the Erythian leaders sent a group of emissaries to meet the strangers. It was a small, unarmed delegation, clad in their traditional robes of peace, standing on the landing strip as the ship's ramp lowered. What they saw when the ramp descended was nothing like they expected. The figures that emerged were tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing armored suits that seemed more suited for war than diplomacy. Their movements were precise, calculated, and deliberate. Their faces were partially obscured by helmets, but what was visible showed no signs of softness or mercy. These beings did not look like the Vreth, but neither did they look like the Erythians. The leader of the alien group stepped forward, a woman whose stance radiated authority. She was the first to speak, her voice harsh and commanding, but not without a sense of directness. "We are the Deathworlders," she said.
"We heard your call. We have come to end the Vreth's hold on this planet." The Erythians were taken aback.
The Deathworlders? The name alone sent shivers through their people. Deathworlders were known throughout the galaxy for their fearsome reputation. They were humans from a planet, Earth, where life had evolved in the most dangerous and hostile environments imaginable. They were survivors, fighters, and warriors.
In many ways, they were everything the Erythians were not. But they were here now, and their arrival sparked a mixture of relief and confusion.
The people of Erythia had never experienced war, had never known a conflict on the scale of what the Deathworlders had endured. They had never seen what these beings could do in battle. Despite the initial shock, the Erythians knew they had little choice but to trust the Deathworlders. If these beings truly meant to help them, they were their last hope. Captain Isolde Griggs, leader of the Deathworlders mission, turned to her team. Her voice was calm but filled with a steely resolve. "We'll fight," she said, "but make no mistake, this will not be a rescue mission. We are not here to negotiate. We are here to win." The Erythians, still reeling from their loss, had no other choice but to accept the Deathworlders' terms. There was no time left for second guesses. The Wraith were close, and their grip on the planet was tightening by the hour. As the Deathworlders began to prepare for battle, the Erythians stood in awe, knowing that this unlikely band of warriors might just be their only chance to survive. The days following the arrival of the Deathworlders were filled with tension and uncertainty. The Erythians, still struggling to comprehend their new reality, watched in awe as these strange warriors prepared for the battle that could determine the fate of their planet. The Deathworlders had made their intentions clear. They were not here for negotiation. They had come to end the Wraith's reign of terror over Erythia. And as they prepared, the people of Erythia could only hope that they were not making a terrible mistake by placing their trust in these warriors. Captain Isolde Griggs stood at the front of the Deathworlder camp, looking out over the vast desert landscape. The wind blew across the barren ground, kicking up dust as her soldiers worked tirelessly to set up their base of operations. They were preparing for an assault, a strike that would hit the Vreth hard and fast. Isolde had seen many battles in her life, but this one felt different. There was something about this planet that felt fragile, a delicate beauty that contrasted sharply with the brutal mission at hand. Her team was ready. They had been preparing for weeks, studying the Vreth's tactics, learning the layout of the cities they had attacked, and analyzing the terrain of Erythia itself. The Deathworlders were masters of guerrilla warfare, and they intended to use every advantage that the planet's environment offered them. They had trained themselves to survive in harsh conditions, and they would use that training to turn the tables on the Wraith. But as the Deathworlders made their final preparations, the Erythian leaders still struggled with their decision. They had been forced into this situation, their peaceful society now caught in the middle of a war that they never wanted. How could they trust these brutal warriors who had shown up so unexpectedly? What if the Deathworlders were simply using them as pawns in a larger game? The questions plagued the minds of the Erythians, but there was no time for doubt. The Wraith were already on the move, and the Erythians had no choice but to put their faith in their new allies. The first real test came sooner than expected. The Vreth launched an attack on one of the Erythian cities that had been partially rebuilt after the initial invasion. The Erythians had been hoping to keep a low profile, but the Vreth were relentless. They knew no mercy, no hesitation. They would crush every last resistance, and they would do it swiftly. Captain Griggs received word of the Wraith's assault in the early hours of the morning. She didn't hesitate. With a sharp command, she mobilized her forces, preparing for the most dangerous mission yet. The Deathworlders knew that they were walking into enemy territory, that every step could be their last, but they were ready. Isolde had trained her team to expect nothing less than the harshest conditions. They moved quickly, their ships cutting through the atmosphere like shadows in the night. The Erythian civilians, still unsure of what to expect, gathered together, watching in silent fear as the Deathworlders prepared for battle. They had never seen anything like it. The soldiers were efficient, organized, and utterly focused on the task at hand. The Erythians could only watch as their unexpected saviors readied their weapons and set off toward the conflict. The city under siege was a vital stronghold for the Wraith, and they were determined to maintain control over it. It was located near a river, surrounded by thick forests that provided cover for both sides. The Deathworlders knew that they could not afford to fight the Vreth head-on. They had to strike fast, using surprise and deception to gain the upper hand. Isolde led her team into the heart of the city, moving with speed and precision. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the distant sounds of explosions and the occasional cry of a Wraith soldier. The Vreth were using their advanced technology to wage war, but the Deathworlders had one thing the Vreth didn't: the ability to adapt to any environment, to survive in the most extreme conditions. The battle was brutal. The Vreth had set up defensive positions throughout the city, but the Deathworlders moved swiftly, neutralizing threats one by one. They didn't hesitate. They didn't waste time. Every move was calculated, every strike deliberate. The Erythians watched in awe as the Deathworlders moved through the city, their soldiers clearing buildings, taking down Wraith patrols, and securing key positions. Captain Griggs, leading from the front, showed no fear. She moved with the confidence of someone who had seen countless battles and had always come out victorious. Her face remained calm, her mind focused on the task ahead. The Deathworlders were relentless, and they weren't about to let the Vreth take another step forward. But despite their success, the Deathworlders faced a serious challenge. The Vreth were not easy opponents. They had powerful weapons, advanced armor, and a fierce determination to maintain their control over Erythia. The Deathworlders had expected this, but even they were taken aback by the sheer scale of the Wraith's response. As the battle raged on, the Deathworlders began to realize that this was not going to be a quick victory. The city was on fire. Buildings crumbled as explosions rocked the streets, sending shockwaves through the air. The Wraith were using heavy artillery, their weapons capable of destroying entire blocks at once. But the Deathworlders were prepared. They used the chaos to their advantage, setting traps and ambushes that caught the Vreth off guard. The battle became a brutal game of cat and mouse, with the Deathworlders stalking their prey and taking down enemies from the shadows. In one particularly intense firefight, Isolde found herself face to face with a Wraith general, a towering figure covered in thick armor. The general was armed with a plasma cannon, a weapon that could decimate anything in its path. But Isolde was not afraid. She had faced worse odds before. The two warriors clashed in a violent exchange, each one determined to come out on top. The Wraith general was powerful, but Isolde was faster. She dodged his blasts, weaving in and out of cover as she moved toward him. With a precise strike, she disabled the plasma cannon and knocked the general to the ground. But the battle was far from over. The Deathworlders were pushing the Vreth back, but it was clear that they were not yet victorious. The Vreth had reinforcements on the way, and the fight would only get harder from here. As the sun began to set, the city was still in turmoil. The Deathworlders had made significant progress, but they knew that the real battle was just beginning. Isolde took a moment to survey the battlefield, her eyes scanning the city for any signs of movement. The Erythians, who had been watching from the safety of their shelters, now looked to the Deathworlders with new respect. They had seen what the Vreth were capable of, but they had also seen what the Deathworlders could do. And for the first time in months, the Erythians dared to hope. But even as the Deathworlders gained ground, the question remained. Could they really defeat the Wraith? The Erythians had no military experience, no weapons to defend themselves. The Deathworlders were their only hope, and they had no choice but to trust them. As night fell, the city was eerily quiet. The sounds of battle had faded, but the war was far from over. The Deathworlders would have to move quickly, pushing deeper into the Wraith's territory if they were to have any chance of victory. Isolde knew that they couldn't afford to wait. They had to strike hard and fast. With her team ready to move, Captain Griggs turned to face the Erythians. "We've given you a chance," she said, her voice firm and resolute.
"But the real battle starts now. We need your help."
"If we are going to win, we must fight together." The Erythians, though still afraid, knew what they had to do. They had placed their trust in the Deathworlders, and now it was time to stand with them. They would fight, even if it meant risking everything. For the first time in months, they had hope, and they knew that with the Deathworlders by their side, they might just have a chance to save their world. The battle for Erythia was far from over. The Deathworlders had made their mark on the Vreth invaders, but the Vreth were not easily deterred. Their hold on the planet, while shaken, had not been broken. The Erythians, having witnessed the strength and precision of the Deathworlders in battle, were now ready to fight alongside them. The moment had come for them to stand together, to reclaim their planet from the Vreth invaders. Captain Isolde Griggs stood on a rocky outcrop overlooking the ruins of the city. The streets, once filled with bustling civilians, now lay in ruins, with smoke rising from collapsed buildings. The battle had torn through the heart of Erythia, leaving the landscape scarred and broken. But it was not over yet. The Wraith had not given up, and they were massing for a counterattack that could tip the balance of power in their favor. Isolde's eyes scanned the horizon. Her soldiers were busy fortifying positions, repairing their damaged equipment, and preparing for the next wave of combat. The Deathworlders were seasoned warriors, used to fighting in extreme conditions, but this battle had tested even their resolve. The Vreth were relentless, and they had no intention of retreating. "We don't have much time," Isolde muttered to herself. "The Vreth are preparing for a full-scale assault. We need to hit them first." Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. It was Sergeant Luke Harper, one of the Deathworlders' most experienced soldiers. His face was covered in dirt and sweat, and his eyes were sharp with focus. "We're ready, Captain," he said, his voice calm and steady.
The Erythians are in position, and we've set up our defenses. We've also got the artillery teams stationed along the outer perimeter, ready to strike when we give the signal. Isolde nodded.
"Good! Let's make sure they know we're not backing down." The plan was simple. The Deathworlders would lead the charge, using their superior combat tactics to push back the Wraith and force them into a retreat.
The Erythians, though inexperienced in warfare, would fight alongside them, providing support where needed. Their role would be crucial in tipping the scales, giving the Deathworlders the edge they needed to secure victory. The first wave of Wraith soldiers came at dawn. Their ships descended from the sky, releasing hordes of foot soldiers clad in advanced armor. They were met by the thunderous fire of the Deathworlders' guns, and the battle erupted in a flurry of explosions and gunfire. The Erythians, armed with whatever weapons they could find, joined the fray, pushing back against the invading forces with all their might. Captain Griggs led the charge, her movements fluid and precise. She moved through the battlefield with the grace of a seasoned fighter, directing her soldiers as they cut through the Wreath lines. She was a force to be reckoned with, and the Vreth soon realized that they were facing an enemy unlike any they had encountered before. The Vreth retaliated with everything they had. Their forces were large and their weapons powerful, but the Deathworlders were not intimidated. They knew how to use the terrain to their advantage, setting traps and ambushes that caught the Vreth off guard. The city, though destroyed, became a battleground of chaos and strategy, with both sides fighting for every inch of ground. For hours, the battle raged on. The sound of gunfire echoed through the ruins as the Deathworlders and Nerithians fought side by side, determined to push the Vreth back. Despite the overwhelming odds, they held their ground, fighting with a desperation that only came from knowing that their world was on the line. As the sun rose higher in the sky, the Vreth began to regroup. They had suffered significant losses, but they were not about to retreat. Their commander, a cold and ruthless figure known only as Vax, had ordered a final push to crush the resistance once and for all. He knew that the Deathworlders were formidable opponents, but he was confident that the Vreth's sheer numbers would overwhelm them. Vrax's forces advanced, storming the Deathworlder positions with renewed determination. The battle took on a brutal intensity, with explosions shaking the ground and the air thick with the sound of combat. The Deathworlders fought fiercely, but they were being pushed back. The Vreth were too many, and they were closing in from all sides. In the midst of the chaos, Captain Griggs found herself facing off against Vrax himself. The Vreth commander was a towering figure, his armor reinforced with heavy plating, making him nearly impervious to the Deathworlders' weapons. He carried a massive energy sword, its blade crackling with deadly energy. His presence alone was enough to instill fear in the hearts of his enemies, but Isolde was not afraid. She had faced worse opponents before, and she knew that fear was the enemy of victory. With a fierce battle cry, she charged at Vrax, her sword raised high. The two warriors collided in a clash of metal, their blades ringing out as they locked in combat. Isolde moved with the precision of a trained fighter, parrying Vrax's strikes and looking for an opening. But the Vreth commander was powerful, and his attacks came fast and relentless. For every strike Isolde blocked, Vrax pushed harder, using his size and strength to overwhelm her. But Captain Griggs refused to back down. She fought with the fury of someone who had everything to lose. Every movement was calculated, every strike purposeful. She knew that if she fell, the rest of her team would suffer. The battle raged around them as the two warriors fought, their blades clashing again and again. Isolde's arms ached with the effort, but she pushed through the pain, determined to end this fight once and for all. She saw an opening, a slight weakness in Vrax's stance, and with a swift motion she disarmed him, sending his energy sword flying from his grasp. Vrax staggered back, fury in his eyes. He reached for a pulse gun at his side, but before he could react, Isolde lunged forward, knocking him to the ground. She held her blade to his throat, her chest heaving with exertion. "Give up," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline rushing through her veins. "This fight is over." Vrax snarled, but he knew the battle had been lost. The Deathworlders had proven themselves far more resilient than he had anticipated. With a final defeated glare, he lowered his head.
"I'll be back," he muttered. The Vreth never forget. Isolde's grip tightened on her blade, but she did not strike.
"You've lost this battle," she said coldly, "and you'll lose the war." With that, she motioned to her soldiers to take Vrax into custody. The Vreth had been pushed back, and for the first time in weeks, the Deathworlders and Erithians could breathe a sigh of relief. The city was theirs, but the war was not over. The Vreth were still out there, and they would not give up easily. As the Deathworlders regrouped and tended to the wounded, Captain Griggs looked out over the battlefield. The Erithians had fought bravely, but they knew this was only the beginning. There were many more battles to come, and the road ahead would be long and difficult. But for now, they had won. The Erithians gathered around the Deathworlders, their faces filled with gratitude and awe. They had seen the strength of their allies, and they now knew that they had a fighting chance. The Wraith were not invincible, and with the Deathworlders at their side, they could win this war. Isolde walked toward the Erythian leaders, her eyes focused on the task ahead.
"This battle is over," she said, "but the war is far from finished. We'll need all of you if we are to win." The Erythians nodded, determination now burning in their hearts.
They had been given a second chance, and they would fight with everything they had. They would not let their world fall. And with the Deathworlders at their side, they knew that they could take back their planet, one battle at a time. The days following the victory in the city were filled with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. The Erythians, once fearful and hopeless, now stood side by side with the Deathworlders, their new allies, as they cautiously celebrated their hard-earned success. But the war was far from over. The Vreth had been dealt a major blow, but they were not a force easily defeated. It was clear that this would not be a short battle, and Erythia's struggle for survival was far from over. Captain Isolde Griggs stood near the edge of a large tent, her eyes scanning the horizon. The sun was setting over the wreckage of the city. The once gleaming towers, now reduced to rubble, seemed to mirror the uncertainty that lay ahead. Her team had fought bravely, and the Erythians had proven themselves valuable allies, but the Deathworlders knew that they had only won one battle. The Wraith would regroup, and they would be back for more. "We have to keep moving," Isolde muttered under her breath. Sergeant Luke Harper, who had been with her throughout the entire campaign, approached. His uniform was still stained with the dust and dirt of battle, and his eyes, though tired, were sharp as ever. "What's the plan, Captain?" he asked, his voice steady, despite the chaos around them. Isolde turned to face him, her expression unreadable.
"We hit them before they can regroup. We don't give them a chance to recover." Luke nodded in agreement.
He knew that the Deathworlders operated with one simple rule: strike fast, hit hard, and never let the enemy rest. "We're ready," he said.
"The Erythians are organizing their forces. They'll follow your lead." Isolde's mind was focused on the task ahead.
The battle for Erythia was not over, and the Wraith had made it clear that they would not back down. But the Deathworlders had something the Wraith did not: resilience. They had survived the harshest environments and fought through impossible odds. They were survivors, and they would fight until the very end. That evening, Isolde gathered her team for a briefing. The camp had been set up on the outskirts of the city, far from the remains of the battle. It was quieter here, the only sounds being the distant hum of machinery and the murmurs of Erythian civilians preparing for the next wave of fighting. The Deathworlders' presence had brought a new sense of hope, but it also reminded the Erythians of the harsh reality that lay ahead. They were not out of danger yet. "We have a window of opportunity," Isolde began, addressing her team. "The Wrath have suffered heavy losses, but they will be sending reinforcements soon. We have to strike before they get the chance to fortify their positions. Our goal is to hit them hard and fast, keep them on the defensive. We'll move at first light." The soldiers listened intently, their faces serious and focused. There was no room for hesitation. The Deathworlders had a job to do, and they would see it through to the end. The Erythians, though inexperienced in warfare, had proven themselves invaluable allies. They had helped the Deathworlders secure key positions during the battle, and now they were preparing to fight alongside them once more. Their spirits had lifted, their fear replaced by determination. They knew the road ahead would be dangerous, but they were no longer willing to cower in the shadow of the Wraith. The next morning, the Erythian forces joined the Deathworlders at dawn, ready for the next phase of the campaign. They had come a long way from the frightened civilians who had first encountered the Deathworlders, and now they were soldiers, standing tall alongside their new allies. The battle ahead would be their first real test. The Deathworlders led the charge, their soldiers moving with deadly precision as they navigated through the forests that surrounded the city. The terrain was rough, and the air thick with the scent of smoke and burning debris. The Erythians followed closely behind, their hearts pounding with anticipation. They were nervous, but they had learned quickly from their allies. They knew what had to be done. Isolde's plan was simple but effective. She intended to strike at the heart of the Vreth's remaining stronghold, a heavily fortified base that lay several miles from the city. The Vreth had established a supply line there, and it was crucial that the Deathworlders destroy it before the enemy could regroup. The plan was to move under the cover of darkness, infiltrate the base, and destroy the supply line. Once that was done, they would retreat and leave the Vreth stranded, unable to maintain their assault on Erythia. The journey to the Vreth base was tense, the soldiers moving silently through the underbrush, each step taken with care. The Erythians, still new to this kind of warfare, followed the Deathworlders' lead, staying low and keeping their heads down. The terrain was difficult to navigate, but they pushed forward, knowing that the success of the mission depended on their ability to move undetected. As they neared the Vreth base, the Deathworlders set up a perimeter, using their advanced technology to create a temporary shield that would block any incoming signals from the Vreth. The Erythians did their part, preparing explosives and positioning themselves in the shadows, ready to strike. The plan was set into motion. Captain Griggs led the charge, her soldiers moving swiftly and silently as they infiltrated the enemy base. The Vreth were caught off guard, their defenses crumbling under the relentless assault. The Deathworlders fought with a fury that only those who had survived the harshest conditions could understand. They moved with precision, their weapons cutting through the Vreth forces like a hot knife through butter. The Erythians, despite their inexperience, fought with all their might. They had been trained by the Deathworlders, and their efforts were not in vain. They took down enemies with the same tenacity that their allies showed, their courage growing with each victory. The mission was a success. The supply line was destroyed, and the Vreth were left in disarray. Their forces were scattered, unable to regroup and continue their assault on Erythia. The Deathworlders had done what they came to do, and they had done it well. But even as they celebrated their victory, the reality of the situation remained clear. The war was far from over. The Vreth would regroup. They would send reinforcements, and the Deathworlders would be there to meet them, ready for whatever came next. As the soldiers made their way back to camp, their faces were filled with a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. They had won this battle, but they knew that the next one would be just as hard. The war for Erythia was far from over, but with each victory, the Deathworlders and Erythians grew stronger. They were no longer just survivors. They were warriors, standing together in the face of a common enemy. The Erythians had been rescued, but the price of freedom was high. The Vreth would not give up easily, and the battle ahead would be long and hard. But the Erythians were no longer afraid. They had seen the strength of the Deathworlders, and they had fought beside them. They knew that with their new allies at their side, they had a chance to win this war. And as the sun set over the war-torn landscape of Erythia, Captain Griggs looked out over the battlefield, knowing that the fight was far from finished. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of hope. They would fight until the very end, and they would do it together. The dawn of a new era had begun.